What's going on?
Going fast.
What's going on?
The bedroom is on fire. My house is going fast.
Okay, we're on the way. Just calm down. Is anybody upstairs?
I am, and I can't get down.
You can't get down?
No.
Okay.
The statistics put out by Indigenous and Northern Affairs Canada in 2010 states that people living on a First Nation in Canada are 10.4 times likely to die in a house fire than any other place in Canada. That's a staggering statistic. That's a scary statistic. It's unbelievable to me. It pisses me off. I'm sure it angers a lot of you as well.
Fire doesn't discriminate, but it can be prevented. In the past 12 months, 15 First Nations people have died due to fire-related causes. These deaths may have been preventable. On the issue of fire protection, the Ontario Native Firefighters Society, ONFFS, has engaged in consultations and community visits with First Nation firefighters, fire prevention officers, fire chiefs, and other fire protection stakeholders across the province. A strategic plan has been developed by the ONFFS, which is multi-tiered and achievable. We have developed the following 8 recommendations. Partnerships. The Ontario Region First Nations Fire Protection Strategic Plan outlines 3 major partnerships between ONFFS and various stakeholders, namely Indigenous and Northern Affairs Canada, the Office of the Ontario Fire Marshal, and the Ministry of Natural Resources. The development of an Ontario Region First Nation Fire Protection Advisory Committee is also necessary to inform how these partnerships will serve Ontario First Nation communities and navigate wild land and urban interfaces. Legislation. First Nation communities are the exclusive responsibility of the Government of Canada. However, there is no legislative framework to mandate fire prevention and protection standards. A First Nation Fire Prevention and Protection Act can aid in the development of standards and policy to guide the work of regional First Nation fire protection services and associations. First Nation Fire Commissioner's Office. There is no Fire Commissioner or Fire Marshal's office responsible for First Nation communities. The creation of the Federal First Nations Fire Commissioner's Office would be the principal advisor to government on First Nations fire protection and public safety. This office would also be responsible for the administration support and enforcement of the proposed federal legislation. Ontario Region First Nation Fire Incident Reporting System. Currently, there is no requirement for Ontario First Nations to submit statistical information on fires occurring within their community. This data is vital to identifying fire safety issues and prioritizing funding to fire prevention and protection programs and infrastructure projects which will reduce fire deaths and property damage in First Nation communities. Anishinaabe-Aski Fire and Emergency Services. The creation of Anishinaabe-Aski Fire and Emergency Services, similar to the police service, would provide the needed oversight for fire prevention and protection in multiple remote and semi-remote First Nation communities in a much more cost-effective and fiscally responsible manner. These services would allow for adequate delivery of fire prevention and fire protection services by providing administrative support, training, policy, recruitment, retention programs, and preventative maintenance programs for facilities, equipment, and vehicles. First Nation Community Fire Prevention Standards. The INAC Level of Services standards were implemented in April of 2016. These standards have a great potential to positively impact First Nation fire protection. However, in order to maximize these standards, a training program is required to educate First Nations with the funding requirements in order to better understand the potential positive impacts. Community Fire Protection Assessments. Currently, no minimum simplified community risk assessments, fire services standards, or training standards exist for Ontario Region First Nations. 3 initiatives have been developed which can be adapted: the Simplified Risk Assessment from the Office of the Ontario Fire Marshal, the Fire Service Inspection and Audit Checklist from the BC Fire Commissioner's Office, and the Minimum Fire Training Standards from the BC Fire Commissioner's Office. First Nations Regional Fire and Emergency Services Training Centers. It is the recommendation of the ONFFS that 3 First Nation-operated regional fire and emergency services training centers be established in 3 regions: Northern District, Sioux Lookout Area First Nation to be determined. Central District, Garden River First Nation. And Southern District, 6 nations of the Grand River First Nation, where a training academy has already been established. The creation of these centers would allow for a regular annual training schedule to be established, which could be delivered by First Nations emergency service professionals to First Nations people. Fire prevention. Amber's Fire Safety Program. The Anishinaabe Nation unveiled the Amber's Fire Safety Campaign in 2016 in memory of Amber Strang, a 5-month-old girl who passed away tragically in a house fire in March 2016 on the Pikangikum First Nation. Upon review of the Amber's Fire Safety Program, an opportunity exists to expand upon its delivery to other First Nation communities within the Ontario region. Be Fire Safe Fire Prevention Smoke and CO Detector Program. It is the recommendation of the ONFFS to continue the Be Fire Safe Fire Prevention Smoke CO Alarm Training Program annually to ensure that smoke and CO detectors have been installed in every Ontario region First Nation home and fire prevention programs are being delivered adequately and regularly in First Nation communities. Fire Prevention Officer, Fire Chiefs. As identified within the INAC Joint First Nations Fire Protection Strategy, a main theme of the level of service standards for fire protection is the importance of fire prevention and fire prevention education. To allow for adequate delivery of fire prevention and smoke alarm programs, it is important to establish at a minimum 1 paid full-time adequately trained fire prevention officer or fire chief per First Nation community through the entire Ontario region. First Nations Fire Protection Funding. First Nation fire protection funding needs to become targeted and secured. Intergovernmental, federal, and provincial agency cooperation and support is needed to assist in the protection of federal, provincial infrastructure investments in First Nation communities and assist in reducing the disproportionately high amount of First Nations fire-related deaths in the province of Ontario. It is the recommendation of the ONFFS to engage with both federal and provincial governments to initiate discussion and develop an Ontario First Nations Fire Death Reduction Fund and strategy.
The bottom line is we do not have the resources necessary to do the things on our First Nations that we'd like to do. If you don't have the equipment, how are you going to fight the fire? If you don't have the manpower trained to do it, what are you going to do? So this is why we're revamping our strategic plan for Ontario, and hopefully that's going to set a new path for us, meaning that our First Nations will be trained now, just like our non-Native brother and sister in the neighboring community. Our goal is to help all the First Nations in Ontario become fire safe.
This solution-focused plan will build upon previous fire protection efforts and exist as a living document which will serve as both a roadmap and a guide to identify Ontario Region First Nation fire protection issues. The only way we can further develop fire prevention, fire protection, and emergency services in all First Nations communities is by working collectively to achieve these goals.